Beneath 1,000 crystals on Bellevue Avenue, the season's grandest ball sparkles like a promise, until one kiss shatters everything. Bella Moreau arrives in lavender hope, and watches her magnate husband bend toward another woman under the chandeliers. In that breathless hush, reputations tremble, alliances shift, and a secret long-buried stirs to life. Is this the return of a past she fought to escape, or the first step toward a future claimed on her own terms? Between duty and desire, one choice will redraw the map of every heart in the room. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what do you love most about historical romance? The scandal, the slow-burn glances, or the unforgettable redemption? Newport, Rhode Island, summer of 1895. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and roses into the marble halls of the Bellevue Avenue mansion, where the grandest ball of the season unfolded beneath 1,000 lights. The chandeliers, dripping with crystal and pride, cast their brilliance upon gowns of imported silk, men in immaculate tailcoats, and a city determined to forget its soot and steel for one glittering evening. Bella Moreau entered through the arched doorway as though the air itself had changed with her arrival. Her gown, lavender satin tinged with pearl, floated as she walked, every movement a whisper of grace and quiet purpose. She had chosen the color deliberately, soft enough to suggest forgiveness, dignified enough to remind the world she had nothing to prove. A faint shimmer of powder traced her shoulders, and her gloved hands trembled only once when she glimpsed her reflection in a mirror framed with gold. The woman she saw there was no debutante, no fragile ornament of wealth. She was 36 years old, tall, poised, her beauty not that of innocence, but of endurance. The orchestra swelled. Violas murmured beneath the rise of violins as couples circled the dance floor in perfect symmetry. Laughter, sharp, musical, practiced, echoed across the marble. Bella moved among them with a serenity that cost her dearly. She felt the familiar eyes of Newport society upon her, the discreet appraisals, the tilted fans, the murmured comments that followed her husband's name wherever she went. Everett Moreau, railroad magnate, symbol of industrial modernity, the man who could turn soot into fortune. He was already there. She saw him at the far end of the ballroom, standing beneath a cascade of ivy and lanterns, his tall frame immaculate in black and white. His hair, fair and perfectly combed, caught the light in a way that still tightened her heart. For a fleeting instant, Bella believed he might look up, meet her eyes, and remember the promise he once made in a garden many summers ago, to build a life with her, not merely an empire, but Everett's gaze was fixed elsewhere. She followed it, an instinct she despised yet could not resist, and saw her. The Duchess Evelyn Ravenshire, a vision of imported allure, draped in midnight velvet and crowned with jewels that rivaled the chandeliers themselves. Her laughter was low, the kind that drew men forward and made women stiffen. She leaned closer to Everett, her hand brushing his sleeve as if it were the most natural act in the world. The intimacy was not bold, but it was deliberate, a performance meant for an audience of one. Bella's breath caught. Around her, the waltz continued, swirling satin and candlelight, while the air seemed to thin. A gentleman spoke to her, asking for a dance, but his voice was nothing more than a faint vibration. All she could see was Everett leaning toward the Duchess, their faces closer now, so close that a murmur rippled through the crowd. Then, under the indifferent glitter of the chandeliers, Everett kissed her. It was not a lover's kiss, but it was worse. A public gesture, measured and intentional, a declaration that invited judgment. Gasps bloomed like broken glass across the room. Fans snapped shut. A whisper reached Bella's ear, someone saying her name, a pitying sound dressed as sympathy. For one suspended moment, time stilled. The music faltered, then recovered, as if even the orchestra hesitated to bear witness. Bella stood rooted where she was, her gloved hands clasped before her, her posture unbroken. Only the faintest tremor in her breath betrayed her. She felt not anger yet, nor sorrow, only a piercing clarity, a silence so complete it seemed to echo within her. Everett stepped back, adjusting his cuffs as though nothing at all had happened. Evelyn turned her head and smiled, an exquisite, poisonous smile directed toward Bella. Around them, conversation resumed, brittle and false, the way high society patches its scandals before dawn. Bella did not move. The scent of lavender and wax filled her senses. The weight of her gown anchored her to the polished floor. Her mind refused to race. It sharpened instead, cool and deliberate. The humiliation would make its rounds by morning, and Everett would explain it away with the ease of a man accustomed to power. But something within her shifted, subtle as a blade turned in its sheath. A clock struck midnight. Its chime rolled through the ballroom, deep and resonant, marking the exact second her world altered course. She turned then, without drama, without tears. The pearls at her throat caught the light one last time as she passed beneath the chandeliers and into the marble corridor, leaving behind the murmurs, the music, and the marriage that had just fractured in silence. Outside, the ocean wind greeted her like an accomplice. The night was cool and silver, and the sound of waves against the cliffs carried the steady rhythm of inevitability. Somewhere behind her, the ball continued in its endless cycle of appearances and deceit. But Bella Moreau walked toward her carriage with her head high, her lavender skirts brushing against the marble steps like the whisper of a vow yet unspoken, one she would soon make not to a man, but to herself. The dawn after the Bellevue ball crept into Newport, not with warmth, but with a chill that clung to the sea mist and crawled through the iron gates of every mansion lining the cliff. The salt air carried more than the scent of brine that morning. It carried whispers. In the drawing rooms where silver was polished before breakfast and scandals were served with tea, the name Bella Moreau passed from mouth to mouth like a fragile relic of sorrow. She had not fainted, they said. She had not wept. She had simply walked out into the night with her chin raised and her lavender gown trailing behind her like a banner of ruined dignity. In kitchens and servant corridors, the murmurs were bolder, sharper. She saw it herself. He didn't even look sorry. The Duchess didn't blink. The footman who opened carriage doors and the maids who picked up forgotten gloves now traded truths more precious than coin, secrets that glinted beneath layers of silk and civility. Within the tall, somber walls of the Moreau estate, the silence was not of peace, but of avoidance. Bella stood in the morning room, surrounded by a stillness that had weight. The windows overlooked the manicured gardens she had designed herself, once symbols of control, now ghostly in the pale light. She wore a house-gown of soft grey silk, trimmed with white lace, her hair drawn back into a modest twist. The garnet pendant at her throat, a gift from Everett years ago, lay cool and inert against her skin. She held a folded copy of the Newport Herald in her gloved hands. The ink was still fresh, and her name, though not directly printed, lurked between every line of insinuation. A prominent gentleman recently seen in close company with a titled European guest was joined last evening by his wife, whose elegant entrance was eclipsed by an even more compelling display of continental affection. Bella's fingers trembled only once before she folded the paper and set it aside. "Mrs. Moreau," came a soft voice from the door. Maisie stood hesitantly, her sandy blonde hair tucked under her cap, her eyes warm with worry. "Would you like tea, ma'am?" Bella looked up, her face unreadable. "Not yet. Just sit with me a moment." Maisie blinked, surprised, but obeyed. She took the far edge of the velvet chaise, her hands folded in her lap, unsure whether to speak. A silence passed between them, neither empty nor cold. Then Bella rose and crossed to a small cabinet nestled in the corner. From within, she drew a worn leather folder, its edges softened by time. She opened it slowly, revealing an old photograph. In the sepia tones of memory, a young girl of 17 stood before a brick warehouse, the letters Whitfield Sugar painted in peeling strokes behind her. She wore a plain dress, her hair unadorned, her gaze steady. There was no one beside her. No father's hand, no mother's shawl, only the weight of survival stitched into every line of her posture. I stood there, the day the deed passed to my name, Bella said quietly. I signed it in ink that bled on my fingers. I buried my parents with nothing but the scent of molasses and smoke still on my skin. No one held my hand. No one offered tea. Maisie lowered her gaze. You built everything yourself. No, Bella corrected gently. I endured everything myself. Building came later. She closed the folder and placed it back into the cabinet. There are ashes under every inch of silk in this house, Maisie. I stitched them into the walls when I agreed to marry a man who preferred ambition to truth. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Measured, deliberate, Bella knew them as well as she knew her own breath. Everett. He entered without knocking, dressed in his charcoal morning coat and dove-grey waistcoat, every button in place, his cravat stiff and without flaw. He removed his gloves slowly, as if unbothered by the invisible wreckage he'd left behind the night before. Maisie stood instinctively, bowed, and left the room. Everett looked at Bella as one might regard a business associate, neutral, composed, but never quite equal. You've seen the paper, he said. I have. Then you understand how the press manipulates things. Bella tilted her head, her eyes calm and glacial. They printed what they saw. He let out a breath through his nose, more irritation than remorse. It was nothing, a moment of civility. Evelyn is... She is irrelevant, Bella interrupted, her voice soft as lace but sharp as glass. This is not about the Duchess. He paused, caught off guard by her stillness. You have embarrassed me, she continued, stepping closer. Publicly, willfully. You made me small before people who would sooner see me fall than share a seat beside me. You're overreacting, Everett said, his jaw tightening. This is society, Bella. Appearances shift, stories fade. No one will remember by next week. She blinked once, slowly. I will. The silence between them now was colder than any accusation. Everett moved to the window, adjusting his cuffs. You're not thinking clearly. You're emotional. I am clear, she said, her voice still even. Clearer than I have ever been. He turned toward her, his eyes narrowing. What do you want? It was the wrong question. I want what I have always wanted, she said. Respect, truth, a partnership, not a parade. He stared at her, perhaps truly seeing her for the first time in months, or perhaps not at all. You're my wife. Bella smiled faintly. That used to mean something. He said nothing, and after a moment left the room. The echo of his footsteps faded down the marble corridor. Later that afternoon, Bella arrived at the modest townhome of Mrs. Letitia Greenfield. The air within smelled of tea and old wood, and the windows were draped in velvet the color of midnight. Letitia sat in her usual armchair, her silver-streaked hair pulled back into a severe knot, her cane resting against her knee. I heard, she said without preamble. Bella removed her gloves with slow precision. Everyone has. Letitia nodded. They will speak. They will sip their brandied tea and pretend to pity you while praying the same doesn't happen to them. Bella sat. Her hands were steady now. I won't leave him. Not yet. Letitia raised a brow. Not yet? I built too much, Bella said. I planted the roses. I balanced the accounts. I trained the staff, drafted the menus, selected every stone in the garden path. If I walk away now, I hand him everything. I become a footnote to a duchess's footstep. And if you stay? Letitia asked, her voice low. I reshape the ground beneath his feet. Letitia leaned back, a slow smile forming. Now that, she murmured, is the Bella I knew was buried under pearls and silence. As the afternoon waned, and the tea cooled between them, Bella Moreau sat straighter in her chair. She was not broken. She was becoming. By nightfall she returned home. The servants bowed, the lamps were lit, and the silence had softened into something else. Expectation. She entered her chambers and opened the armoire, running her fingers along the row of gowns. She passed by the lavender one. She did not weep. She did not touch it. She simply closed the doors with finality. In the mirror, her reflection met her gaze, not mournful, but resolute. She was not the girl in front of the sugar warehouse. She was not the woman dismissed by a kiss. She was Bella Whitfield Moreau, and though her marriage stood in ash, the silk upon her skin no longer felt like a cage. It felt like armor. The morning light in Newport fell pale and deliberate, as though even the sun hesitated before entering the Moreau estate. The great house, once proud and resplendent, now stood wrapped in a silence thick enough to taste. A silence of calculation, of strategy forming in the spaces where words had once lived. Bella sat at her escritoire in the east parlour, the sea visible beyond the terrace, restless and grey. Before her lay a series of neatly stacked documents bound with a silk ribbon. The ink on the signatures was dry, but the resolve behind them was not. Every pen stroke had been placed after a night without sleep, after hours spent with figures, names and numbers that Everett had never thought she understood. Yet she had always known the rhythm of his business, the pulse of his railways, the tremor of debt beneath his proud empire. She had learned it the way some women learned embroidery, quietly, patiently, and to perfection. Maisie entered without a sound, carrying a silver tray. The scent of strong coffee filled the room, mingling with sea air and parchment. "You've been up since before dawn again," she said softly, her tone not reproachful but protective. Bella's eyes lifted briefly from the page. "Sleep offers nothing useful, Maisie. You said the same thing yesterday." "And I was right yesterday," Bella replied, though the corner of her mouth softened. She set down her pen, flexing her fingers, and gestured toward the documents. "Do you know what this is?" Maisie shook her head. "My freedom," Bella said quietly, "or what will pass for it in this world." A knock at the door interrupted them, a sharp, clipped sound that announced its owner more clearly than his voice could. "Everett." Bella straightened in her chair. "Bring the coffee to the table, please," she murmured. Maisie obeyed, setting the silver tray between the chairs by the hearth before slipping from the room like a ghost, closing the door behind her. Everett entered as if the house still belonged to him alone. He wore his usual morning attire, charcoal grey coat, ivory cravat, gold pocket watch gleaming at his vest. Yet there was a tightness around his mouth, a shadow under his eyes. The man who prided himself on composure now looked for the first time like someone calculating losses. "You asked to see me," he said. His tone carried faint irritation, the sound of a man unused to summons. "I did," Bella answered, rising with deliberate grace. "Please sit." He remained standing. "I haven't much time. There's a meeting in town." "About your investors," she interrupted. "Yes, I'm aware." He blinked. "You seem very well informed." "I read," she said simply, "and I listen." Everett's jaw tensed. "If this is about last week's misunderstanding—" "Call it what it was," Bella said calmly. "A humiliation. One that cost you more than my pride." He frowned, uncertain. She gestured to the papers on the table. "Your line is faltering, Everett. The British syndicate you courted has grown hesitant. They are waiting to see if your debts outweigh your promises." "I have matters under control," he replied stiffly. "No," Bella said. "You have matters concealed. There is a difference." His eyes narrowed. "You've been speaking to my accountants?" "I have been reading your ledgers," she said, meeting his gaze. "The ones you leave carelessly in the library after brandy." Everett exhaled through his teeth, torn between annoyance and reluctant admiration. "You've grown bold." "I have grown tired," Bella corrected, her voice steady. "Tired of waiting for you to remember that this house was built by two names, not one." She moved toward the table, untying the silk ribbon and spreading the documents before him. The morning light gleamed on the ink. "You will need my help to secure the investors' confidence. The British trust wives with property, Everett. They understand women who know how to manage an estate, not merely host a supper." He laughed once, short, incredulous. "You cannot expect me to parade my wife as a business partner." "I expect you to survive," Bella said, "and you will not do that without me." He stared at her, the laughter fading. And what precisely do you demand in return for your assistance? Bella took a breath. The words had been prepared, but their delivery was something else, a leap from thought to declaration. You will sign over legal control of my inheritance to my name, in full. No proxy, no counsel. I will not have you mortgaging my fortune to fund your illusions. In addition, you will name me as a partner in the Atlantic and Northern Line. Publicly. Everett's silence filled the room like a storm waiting to break. Then, with a disbelieving smile, he shook his head. You must be joking. I'm not, she said softly. He took a step closer. Do you understand what you are asking? You want me to hand you half of my empire because you've suddenly grown a taste for rebellion. I'm asking for what is mine, she said, and what I've earned. He leaned closer still, voice low. You have no idea what this world would do to a woman who forgets her place. Bella met his gaze without flinching. Then, let it learn mine. For a long moment the air between them trembled with unspoken things. Pride, fear, and something dangerously close to awe. Everett's expression shifted, uncertain, as though the ground beneath him had tilted. What if I refuse? He asked finally. Then I write to the investors myself, Bella replied. And I tell them the truth. That the man asking for their money gambles his fortune on vanity and loses his honor at masquerade balls. Everett's hand tightened on the back of the chair. You would not dare. I have already drafted the letter, she said, her voice nearly a whisper. It waits, sealed, in my desk upstairs. He said nothing. His silence was not surrender, but the slow, grudging recognition of defeat. Finally, he sat down. You have the papers prepared, I assume. I do. Show me. Bella slid the first page toward him. The sound of parchment brushing wood was as sharp as the snap of a blade. He read in silence, his eyes flicking from line to line. Every clause was precise, every word legally binding. Who helped you draft this? He asked after a moment. No one, she replied. You forget I was raised by merchants. I know the language of ownership. He glanced at her, and for the briefest instant, there was something almost human in his expression, a flicker of reluctant respect. You're a dangerous woman, Bella. Only when cornered, she said. He signed the first page, then the second, his signature a series of impatient flourishes. When it was done, he set the pen down and stood. You've won your bargain, he said, but understand this. Once you're part of the game, you'll learn it's not played with gloves. Bella gathered the papers with care. I never needed gloves, she murmured. When Everett left, the air he'd occupied seemed to dissolve behind him. Maisie re-entered moments later, cautious, her eyes darting to Bella's face. Is it done? She asked. It is, Bella said, placing the signed pages inside a leather folder. Maisie approached the table, looking at the ink that still glistened faintly. What will you do now? Bella closed the folder and tied the ribbon once more. Begin. Maisie hesitated, then said quietly, You once told me that stillness can be strength. That silence isn't surrender. Bella looked at her, a soft smile touching her lips. And I was right. Maisie nodded. Then what does this mean now? It means, Bella said, gazing toward the window where the sea shimmered beneath a veil of cloud, that I no longer need to whisper. The afternoon passed in deliberate quiet. Letters were written, calls scheduled, and a single name, Mrs. Bella Whitfield Moreau, was added to the registry of the Atlantic and Northern Line. In drawing rooms and over afternoon teas, the wives and widows of Newport began to murmur once more, but this time their tones had changed. Some called her reckless, others called her brilliant, but all of them watched. When evening came, Bella allowed herself a moment by the fire. The house seemed different now, less like a prison, more like a stage she could command. She touched the folder that lay beside her and whispered to the flames, A wife's bargain is never made in love. It is made in power. Outside, the wind carried the echo of the sea against the cliffs, steady and eternal. Within, Bella Moreau sat very still, her gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the glass. The lavender gown still hung in her wardrobe upstairs, untouched. But tonight, she did not think of it. Tonight, she thought of the ink on paper, of the sound of her husband's signature sealing her freedom, and of the quiet, inexorable truth she now understood, that the most dangerous power in the world is the one that wears a smile. In the golden haze of late July, Newport bloomed with excess. Ivy curled over porticos like green lace. Parasols dotted the lawns of mansions with lavender and pearl, and the sea breeze carried with it the scent of lemon verbena and quiet sabotage. The Duchess Evelyn Ravenshire had arrived not simply as a guest of the season, but as a performance. Her carriages, imported from London and lacquered a shade of obsidian rarely seen in America, glided through Bellevue Avenue like funeral processions draped in wealth. Each morning, her name appeared in ink on invitation cards delivered by gloved footmen, a luncheon for 12 at the Breakers, an afternoon musicale at the Bancrofts', a garden tea with titled friends who had never before graced American soil. And at every table she said it, just once, delicately, always with an air of amused denial. "Oh no, dear me, I wouldn't dream of disrupting Mr. Moreau's household. We are simply dear friends, though one never knows what the future holds, does one?" Her voice was smooth as chilled cream, her laugh effortless, her smile a study in artifice. Those who listened, wives in too tight corsets and mothers with unmarried daughters, tittered politely, but their eyes glittered. Evelyn's presence was like oil spilled over silk, hard to clean, impossible to ignore. Bella watched the game unfold, not from a chaise lounge or marble terrace, but from a distance, sharpened by experience. She did not attend the Duchess's luncheons. She declined invitations with handwritten notes signed in firm, unornamented script. She did not answer the whispers that Evelyn scattered like breadcrumbs behind her. Instead, Bella hosted something altogether different. In the shaded salon of a quiet home along Touro Street, Bella gathered those who were seldom photographed but always informed. The widows whose names still lingered on endowments, the women whose family crests outlived their husbands' fortunes, and the wives who no longer asked permission before speaking. They arrived not in silk but in wool, not dripping diamonds but bearing ledgers, minutes and quiet grievances. Letitia Greenfield, dressed in mourning navy and jet beads, presided with the gravity of a judge. To her left sat Mrs. Alcott, a banking widow who owned more commercial lots than her son-in-law dared count. Across from her, Mrs. Davenport, the elusive patroness behind 2 of Newport's hospitals, adjusted her spectacles and said plainly, "If the Duchess wants the stage, let her take it. We'll rewrite the script." Bella did not smile. She simply folded her hands and said, "We will shift the narrative, not through gossip, through gold." Letitia's cane tapped the floor once. "Reputation," she said, her voice edged with steel, "is a currency more brittle than coin. You must spend it wisely, Bella, and never all at once." The women murmured in agreement. Bella laid out her proposal, a silent consortium of female investors to back the Atlantic and Northern Line's expansion, under discreet terms and under Bella's direction. In return, the new charter would include provisions for widowed workers' pensions, safer conditions for the crews, and naming rights on stations for donors. It would be a public show of generosity, but beneath it would be a network of female power woven so tightly no man could unpick it without unraveling the whole. "That Duchess may dazzle," Bella said, "but she does not know how to build." Outside, the breeze rustled the wisteria, and somewhere in the distance the sea struck rock. The next morning Evelyn hosted a garden tea for the wives of Rhode Island senators. Her gown, pale blue satin with pearl beading, gleamed like water beneath the sun. She spoke of Venice, of opera, of wine-soaked evenings in Vienna, and the dear American gentleman who had reminded her of life's simple pleasures. Her eyes sparkled when she said Everett's name. But later that afternoon, The Newport Herald printed a quiet announcement in its financial column. The Atlantic and Northern Line has named a new female partner to its board, Mrs. Bella Whitfield Moreau, whose discreet investments have ensured the continued expansion of passenger lines from Boston to Baltimore. There were no photographs, no ball gowns, no exclamation points, but the effect was immediate. Evelyn read the article in her sun-drenched boudoir, her expression blank for a long moment. Then she smiled faintly and crushed the paper into her palm, the sound as delicate as silk tearing. By evening, Bella walked alone through the conservatory of her estate, the glass ceiling casting softened moonlight across her path. The scent of night-blooming jasmine hung in the air, blending with the faint trace of old stone warmed by the day. Maisie found her there, a tray in her hands, hesitant. "You've had no supper, ma'am." Bella turned. Her expression was distant but not cold. "I wasn't hungry." Maisie stepped closer. "The women, they've been speaking well of you. I heard Mrs. Davenport say you've changed the wind's direction." Bella allowed herself a breath of silence. "The wind does not change itself, Maisie. Someone must shape the sails." Maisie lowered her voice. "You taught me that stillness doesn't mean weakness." Bella's gaze met hers. "Nor does silence mean surrender." They stood together beneath the arch of white blossoms, two women whose names would never appear in the same breath as dukes or counts, but whose hands, one day, might steer greater ships. Later that night, Bella returned to her writing desk. She penned letters not to society, but to stations, rail lines, builders, women whose husbands had died laying track. She signed them all with her full name, not Everett's wife, not a duchess's rival, herself. Meanwhile, Evelyn Ravenshire, in her perfumed room lit by gas sconces, rewrote her guest list for the next luncheon. Her pen moved with elegance, but her smile was tight. She knew now that this would not be an American season won with charm. It would be war fought with whispers and signatures, and Bella had fired the first true shot without ever lifting her voice. The skies above Newport dimmed with the weight of late summer, a charcoal veil drawn slowly across the horizon. The air had turned humid, heavy with salt and tension, as if the very weather sensed the fraying balance between illusion and truth. Smoke had begun to rise, not from chimneys nor from celebratory torches, but from the iron heart of Everett Moreau's empire. A labor dispute, ignited by the sudden dismissal of 40 workers at the Southern Rail Yard, had spilled beyond the confines of telegrams and ledgers. It festered in the mouths of angry men and printed itself across headlines in ink thick with accusation. "Work halted at Bristol Line," one paper read. "Strike threatens autumn expansion." The words clung to Everett's name like soot. Inside the drawing room of the Moreau estate, the air was thick not with scandal but with strategy. Bella stood at the center of the space, her figure framed by floor-length windows, a sheet of figures in one hand and silence in the other. She wore a dress of steel-grey silk, the color of storm clouds about to break. "I warned him this would happen," muttered Letitia Greenfield, seated in a velvet armchair with her cane resting across her lap. "You cannot drive men past the point of survival and expect gratitude in return." Bella said nothing at first. Her gaze drifted across the papers, where Everett's proposed wage cuts sat stark against columns of profits. "He does not understand them," she said quietly. "Not the workmen. Not their wives, not what it means to count coins before bread." Maisie, standing near the door with a tray of correspondence, dared a question. "And you do?" Bella looked up. "I was raised in a house where sugar bags were patched and ledgers were hand-copied at night. Yes, I do." She turned back to the window, her reflection a soft silhouette against the glass. The world outside shimmered with heat, but the house felt like ice. That afternoon, Bella took her carriage beyond the polished avenues, past the manicured hedgerows, and into the brick-and-cinder belly of Newport's industrial outskirts. There, in a modest building half swallowed by ivy, the Steel Widows' Cooperative held its meetings. It was not a place where society visited, But Bella was not society, not anymore. The room fell still when she entered, her presence unexpected but not unwelcome. These were not women in pearls. They wore calico and wool, their hands calloused from ledgers, laundry, and grief. Yet their eyes were sharp with intelligence, the kind forged in fire, not taught in finishing schools. Mrs. Morley, a broad-shouldered widow with soot-streaked cheeks, stood. "You're Everett Moreau's wife." "I am," Bella said. "And I am also my father's daughter. He built his sugar mills with calluses and never once cut a man's wage to gild a ballroom." A pause, then a nod. Chairs shifted, space was made. And Bella spoke, not in the polished tones of society, but in plain terms. If the cooperative would agree to temporary arbitration, she would guarantee wage protection in the new charter. She promised transparency, not pity, and when she finished, she folded her hands and waited. Mrs. Morley studied her for a long moment before saying, "We'll talk, but not because you wear satin, because you spoke to us like we mattered." By nightfall, a tentative agreement had been made. The strike was stalled. Trains would roll by week's end, and Bella's name had earned a different kind of ink in the press, Mrs. Moreau Broker's Peace, as rail crisis looms. Back at the mansion, Everett stood with the paper in hand, his expression unreadable. He held it, as one might hold a mirror and not know the face within. "She used your name," Evelyn said, her voice like velvet stretched thin. They stood together in the music room, where gold trim glinted beneath lamplight and the scent of lilacs lingered too long. Evelyn wore a gown of crimson and black, too rich for the occasion, too tight to be comfortable. Her lips curved, but there was no sweetness in her smile. "Such cleverness," she purred. "She smiles like a dove but moves like a fox." Everett did not reply. Evelyn stepped closer, her voice dipping lower. "She makes you look soft, as if you've handed her the reins and bowed out of your own business." He turned to her then, slowly. "She saved my business." Her laughter was light and mocking. "And what will that cost you?" He did not answer. Instead, he walked to the decanter, poured himself a measure of whiskey, and drank it without looking at her. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "You forget, my dear Everett, I've known more powerful men than you. Men who buried empires under the illusion of partnership. And I've known women," he said coolly, "who mistook seduction for influence." The air snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Evelyn drew back, wounded not by the words, but by their tone. "You're changing," she said. "No," he replied, "I'm remembering." Later that week, invitations were issued for the annual summer masquerade hosted at the Bancroft estate. It was the most glittering event of the season, where names were floated for marriage, contracts were whispered behind masks, and appearances mattered more than reality. The theme, fire and reflection. Bella received her invitation on thick vellum edged in gold. She studied it without expression, then placed it beside a pair of gloves on her vanity. Maisie entered with a box wrapped in tissue. "Your gown arrived." Bella nodded. "Leave it unopened." Maisie hesitated. "You will go?" "I must," Bella said. "There are wars fought in parlours, and others fought beneath chandeliers." That night the house smelled of lavender water and quiet resolve. Bella stood before the mirror, her hair swept into an elegant chignon, her mask resting delicately in her hands. It was silver, shaped like wings, laced with midnight blue ribbon. As she placed it over her face, she caught her reflection, and for a moment saw not a woman betrayed, but one reborn through fire and forged in her own stillness. Smoke drifted faintly from the hearth, a curl of memory and warning, but in the glass Bella did not look away. There, in the mirror, she met her own gaze and did not blink. The night of the masquerade arrived, wrapped in the breathless heat of a storm that had not yet broken. The air trembled with promise, with tension, with the unspoken truths that hung beneath the silk and sequins of Newport's elite. At the Bancroft estate, The grand hall glowed like a lantern floating in darkness, each window spilling golden light onto the manicured lawns outside. Inside, the room pulsed with color and spectacle. Velvet masks and feathered fans swirled past marble pillars and candlelit chandeliers. A quartet played a sweeping waltz, while laughter rose in bright, brittle bursts. Beneath the sheen of champagne and perfection, the room buzzed with gossip, speculation, and glances too sharp to be polite. Bella entered as the hour struck 9. She wore a gown of deep sapphire silk, the fabric clinging to her form with effortless elegance. Her shoulders were bare, her gloves pearl white, and a silver mask framed her eyes like wings carved of moonlight. Her presence was not announced. It did not need to be. People turned to look, not because of who accompanied her, she arrived alone, but because of what she had become. Power, when quiet, drew attention more fiercely than grandeur. Everett stood across the room, a gold-trimmed mask over his features, his posture impeccable. He looked at her the way one might look at a storm on the horizon, beautiful, undeniable, and beyond control. And beside him, in crimson satin that clung like fire, stood Evelyn Ravenshire. Her mask was a lattice of rubies and lace, her smile sharp beneath it. She saw Bella. She did not look away. For an hour they circled the same space without meeting, dancers weaving between them like threads in a loom of silence. Everett spoke with financiers and judges, Bella with artists and widows. Their words never crossed, but their eyes did, again and again, drawn back like tides to a fixed shore. Then, as the string quartet began the final movement of the midnight waltz, the storm finally arrived. The windows shuddered. A gust of wind hissed through the corridor. Lightning flared over the sea cliffs, illuminating the dancing silhouettes with eerie brilliance. A second later, thunder cracked like a bone breaking against sky. The rain followed in sheets. Guests shrieked and scattered, their laughter turning to gasps as servants rushed to close the terrace doors. The candles flickered. The waltz unraveled. Bella slipped away. She moved down the back corridor, through the heavy doors, and out onto the stone terrace. The rain struck instantly, flattening her skirts against her legs, soaking the mask to her skin. But she did not turn back. Her feet found the familiar path to the cliff walk, the jagged trail of stone and sea that curved like a blade behind the estates. The wind howled. The ocean roared beneath her, waves crashing against the cliffs with fury. Her hair loosened in the wind, dark curls tumbling against her bare neck. Still she walked, the storm lashing her, the rain cold and merciless, the night alive with fire in the clouds. Behind her came footsteps. Bella did not stop. "Bella!" The voice was Evelyn's. When Bella turned, she saw her soaked, panting, her mask askew, her gown clinging to her frame like blood. Her beauty was smeared now, streaked with fury and salt. "Did you think you could walk away?" Evelyn spat. "That you could steal every eye in that room and vanish like a ghost?" Bella stood still, the wind flattening her skirts against her knees. "I didn't steal anything." "You've ruined him," Evelyn hissed. "Do you even see what you've done? You stand there in silk and silence, playing the martyr, while Everett becomes a whisper behind your shadow." "I became a shadow," Bella said quietly, "because I was married to a man who liked his wife silent." Evelyn's eyes flared. "You call that dignity? Hiding behind contracts and sympathy? You are not brave, Bella. You are cold, loveless, calculating." Bella's breath was steady, but her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the force she held back. "I have fought," she said, "for every scrap of respect I own. I have bled for a home I built stone by stone, while you wore velvet and smiled. You speak of love as if it's something to be earned by performance. You perform to be loved. I endure to be free." Lightning slashed across the sky, and for a moment the two women stood frozen in white light, sapphire and crimson, rain-slicked and wild, with cliffs yawning beneath them and judgment above. Evelyn stepped back, the wind stealing her breath. She looked at Bella as if seeing her for the first time, not as a rival, not as a wife, but as something unshakable, unknowable. "You'll regret this," she whispered. Bella said nothing. Evelyn turned and fled, her heels slipping on the wet path, her silhouette vanishing into the storm. Bella stood alone on the cliff walk, rain pouring in rivulets down her arms, her gown soaked through, her mask hanging from her hand. The thunder rolled again, but she did not flinch. Far below, the ocean raged against the rocks with ancient fury. She stared into it, not for comfort, but for confirmation. She had walked this far, through fire and silence, through betrayal and bargaining. And now, standing at the edge of the world, she was not broken. She was becoming. When she returned to the estate, soaked and barefoot, Maisie opened the door without a word. Her eyes widened, but she did not ask. Bella crossed the threshold, removed her gloves one finger at a time, and let the soaked gown fall to the floor like a shroud. She did not speak. She did not cry. She sat by the fire and let the warmth return slowly to her skin. In the mirror above the hearth, she saw herself, hair unbound, cheeks flushed, eyes steady. The storm had not taken her. It had revealed her. The storm had passed, but its remnants lingered like bruises across the landscape. The gardens of Newport, once immaculate, bore signs of nature's fury. Uprooted hedges, shattered greenhouse panes, torn awnings that fluttered like defeated banners. Yet it was not the estates or the manicured avenues that suffered most. It was the tracks. The rail yards to the south had been split by lightning and drowned by flood. Wooden trestles lay in heaps, soaked through and sagging. Telegraph lines crackled with silence. Shipments scheduled with military precision now sat idle in warehouses, crates swelling under moisture, contracts trembling with threat. In the early grey of morning, Bella Moreau arrived at the northern yard in a slate wool riding coat, her skirts tucked up slightly above her boots. Her gloves were already dusted with soot. She did not ask permission. She did not seek escort. She moved through the yard with the clarity of someone who had studied the maps long before anyone thought she might need them. The men watched her, at first with hesitation, then with quiet deference. She pointed to broken lines, to collapsed supports, to the places where reinforcement could begin. She addressed foremen by name, asked questions about terrain, material availability, wage incentives. She did not posture. She instructed. "Use pine for the inner beams," she said. "It's cheaper and easier to cut. Reserve the oak for the support arches." One of the senior engineers nodded, tipping his cap. "Yes, ma'am." From the far end of the yard, Everett stood in the shadow of a canopy, his gloves clean, his coat dry. He watched her without speaking. For the first time, he saw her not as an adornment, not as a wife standing at the edge of the ballroom, but as a figure of command beneath the open sky, sleeves rolled, boots muddy, voice firm. It unsettled him, not because she had changed, but because he realized he had never truly seen her at all. By noon, a temporary track plan had been drawn. By dusk, repairs had begun. Workers nodded when she passed. They did not bow. They respected her. Back at the estate, Bella washed her hands in the deep basin beside the kitchen hearth, her sleeves damp, her cheeks flushed. Maisie set a warm towel beside her, watching with wide, careful eyes. "They listen to you," Maisie murmured. Bella dried her hands slowly. "They listen because I don't speak to be heard. I speak to solve." Maisie hesitated, then said softly, "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." Bella turned. "Yes?" "I've been saving," Maisie said. "A little from each month. I want to open a shop one day, a place where women like me, girls who leave service, can make things with their hands. Cloth, lace, books even." She smiled, embarrassed. "I know it's a silly dream." Bella studied her for a long moment, then crossed the room. From the small drawer at her desk, she drew a folded letter sealed with a bank crest. She placed it gently in Maisie's hands. "I won't make promises," she said, "but I believe in beginnings." Maisie opened it slowly, her fingers trembling. She gasped, then blinked at Bella. You set up an account. Months ago, Bella said. You've been working toward this even when you didn't know it. It was time the world gave something back. Maisie could not speak. She nodded once and turned away before her tears could fall. That evening, Evelyn Ravenshire packed her trunks. The guest house she had rented for the summer was quiet, almost morbid in its stillness. The servants moved with hushed urgency. Her gowns, once laid with ceremony across tufted chairs, now vanished into boxes lined with silk paper. She stood alone in the parlour, still in her storm-stained cloak, staring at the telegram that lay unfolded on the mantel. The London scandal had broken. A flurry of creditors, inquiries, and polite refusals that would soon render her name unwelcome in the very circles she had seduced. The investors who once promised her introductions and influence had changed their allegiance. Bella's name now held weight in contracts and ledgers. Evelyn's was a liability. At dawn, she walked alone to the harbour, cloak clutched at her throat, hair pinned but uncombed. The ship bound for England loomed before her, smoke curling from its chimneys like ghosts rising from regret. The air was salt-soaked, sharp. Gulls wheeled overhead, cackling like cruel debutantes. Evelyn stood at the edge of the dock, watching the loading cranes swing over the hull, the crates marked with the names of the companies she had failed to charm. No one stood beside her. No letters waited in her gloved hand. Only silence, and the realization that even a duchess can be outmaneuvered by a woman no one had thought to fear. She boarded without fanfare, her heels echoing against the gangplank. The ship pulled away from the shore as the sky turned the color of tarnished silver. Back in Newport, Bella stood on her balcony, wrapped in a shawl, watching the sea darken with approaching night. She knew the ship had left. She did not celebrate. Victory, she had learned, was not always loud. It was in the respect of working men, in the quiet dream of a maid becoming a merchant, in the knowledge that the world had changed, even if only slightly, because she had refused to sit still. In the fireplace below, the coals glowed low and steady. The columns that had once held up the illusion of her marriage, deference, silence, compliance, had broken, and in their place something stronger rose, shaped by her hands, brick by quiet brick. Tomorrow she would draft a new clause for the railway's safety protocol. Tonight she would rest, and beneath her silence there burned the certainty that she was no longer waiting to be chosen. She was building something no storm could tear down. The morning light fell differently that day, gentler, as though the sun itself had taken notice of the shift that had occurred in the house on Bellevue Avenue. The storm had passed, the dust had settled, and with it something deeper had rearranged itself, not in thunderclaps, but in the silence that follows when truth is finally spoken and heard. Bella sat at her writing desk, the window open to the garden beyond, where birds moved through the hedges and the last of the storm-torn blossoms lay scattered like forgotten promises. Her gown was simple, a shade of dusty lilac, the colour she often wore when she wished to disappear. But today, even her quiet hues could not mute the sense of gravity that surrounded her. Spread before her on the desk was the new marital agreement, drawn not by Everett's solicitor, but by her own. The pages were thick, the ink dark and steady. Every line had been reviewed, rewritten and reviewed again. It was not a gesture, it was not symbolic. It was law. She did not expect him to come. Yet the knock came just past 10 o'clock, measured and unfamiliar in its restraint. Maisie opened the door, eyes cautious, and Everett stepped inside. He looked as though he had slept little. The sharpness of his collar could not hide the fatigue at the edges of his eyes, nor the faint unease in the way he held his hands behind his back. Bella did not rise. She waited. "I've reviewed the terms," he said finally, his voice quieter than she remembered it ever being, "and I've signed them." He placed the final page on her desk with the signature visible, his name in deliberate strokes, accepting not only legal partnership, but equality. She stared at it for a moment. Then she looked up. What changed? Everett's jaw worked as though he might speak, then thought better of it. He looked down at the paper, then back at her. You did, he said at last. Or maybe I did. I'm not sure which. There was no apology. There was no plea. But the absence of pride, however faint, was something. She nodded once, as though that were all the acknowledgement she would offer, and he, sensing that no further performance would serve him, bowed his head slightly and left the room. The papers remained on her desk, but she did not reach for them. Instead, her gaze fell on a different envelope, sealed in wax, bearing a British crest. She broke the seal slowly and unfolded the letter. Dear Mrs. Moreau, your recent correspondence, as well as your exemplary mediation during the Newport strike and rail repair initiative, has reached us with great interest and respect. It is the consensus of our board that your leadership represents not only a moral, but a financial advantage to any future endeavor. We would be honored to continue negotiations with you directly. The letter was signed by the head of the British syndicate, not by way of Everett, but addressed to her in her name. Not Mrs. Everett Moreau, but Bella Whitfield Moreau. She held the paper to her chest, breath trembling. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of visibility, not in the flicker of glances at a ball, not in the cruel edge of gossip, but in the solid, irrefutable presence of respect. Later that afternoon, Bella took a carriage to the workers' quarters near the South Yard. The air smelled of iron and loam, but also of stew and children's laughter. She walked between rows of modest homes, nodding at widows she had quietly supported, at teachers she had paid to educate the labourers' sons and daughters, at men who rose when she passed but did not bow. In the school kitchen, she watched a girl no older than 12 stirring a pot too big for her arms. The child looked up, startled, and Bella crossed the room without speaking. She took the ladle, gently nudging the girl aside. You stir with your elbow, she said softly, demonstrating. Not your shoulder. Let the weight do the work. The child nodded shyly. For a long time, Bella stayed there, stirring soup, washing vegetables, wiping counters. No one took her photograph. No one announced her arrival. And still, the room felt full of meaning. When she returned home that evening, the house was quiet. Maisie found her in the music room, not at the piano, but seated on the chaise, her gloves still in her lap. Dinner is ready, Maisie said gently. Bella did not look up. Her eyes were glassy, though no tears fell. I received a letter today, she said, her voice low. They wrote to me. Not to Everett. To me. Maisie stepped closer. You deserve it. I don't know what to do with the feeling, Bella whispered. For so long I've worked in silence. I never wanted applause, but to be acknowledged. It hurts more than I expected. Maisie knelt beside her. Because you waited so long to believe it could happen. Bella finally let one tear fall, then another. Not from grief, but from the soft, unexpected ache of being seen. She leaned forward, pressing her hands to her face, shoulders trembling in silence. Maisie stayed at her side, not speaking, not moving, simply holding the space as one woman does when she knows the other needs no words. As the fire crackled low and dusk folded over the windows, Letitia Greenfield arrived. She did not knock. She entered as one who belonged. She carried in her hand a small box wrapped in velvet ribbon. I heard, she said simply. Bella stood, wiping her eyes, trying to gather herself. I wasn't expecting visitors. Then I'm precisely on time, Letitia replied. She handed her the box. Bella opened it slowly, the ribbon falling away like old restraint. Inside lay a delicate gold locket, shaped like a teardrop, with a single pearl at its center. This belonged to my mother, Letitia said softly. She wore it when she opened her first school, when they told her it was foolish. When they said no woman could manage a staff, she wore it every day for 32 years. Bella touched the chain reverently. I can't accept this. You already have, Letitia said, her voice trembling just once. The world may doubt you, Bella. It may try to silence you again and again, but I never will." Bella clutched the locket, her eyes closing. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not victory, not power, belonging. And in that moment, as the fire warmed the walls and the rain returned in soft rhythm on the windows, Bella Whitfield Moreau understood that some legacies were not built in noise, but in the quiet acts of resilience passed from woman to woman, like lockets tucked close to the heart. The morning of the charter signing dawned with a solemn hush over Newport, as if the city itself sensed that something was about to shift. The sky stretched pale and cloudless above the sea, and the gulls circling the harbour did so with less clamour than usual. There was no storm in the air, no thunder waiting beyond the horizon, but there was tension, coiled and deliberate, in the hearts of those who knew what the day would bring. Bella stood before her mirror, fastening the final hook of her high-collared navy walking gown. Her hands were steady, her breath calm. The garnet pendant, once her constant adornment, rested on the edge of her vanity, the chain coiled like a question she no longer needed to answer. In its place, pinned above her heart, was a modest sapphire brooch in the shape of a crescent moon. It had no sentimental history. She had chosen it herself, paid for it with her own money, and worn it with purpose. Letitia Greenfield entered the room unannounced, her cane tapping softly against the hardwood floor. She wore mourning plum, as she always did, but the weight of age had shifted on her, less armour now, more crown. She paused by the door, her sharp eyes sweeping Bella's figure as if inspecting a soldier before battle. "They will smile in your face and write you out of the records the moment your back is turned," she said, voice dry as a pressed leaf. Bella did not turn from the mirror. "Then I will sign the records myself." Letitia nodded once. "That's what I came to hear." The public signing of the Atlantic and Northern Line Charter was held in the newly restored hall near the central yard, an expansive space with arched windows and steel beams freshly painted a crisp, unyielding white. Banners hung from the rafters in sober shades of navy and gold. There were no floral garlands, no orchestras playing cheerful preludes. It was not a celebration, it was a declaration. When Bella arrived, heads turned, not in gossip, but in acknowledgement. She walked the length of the hall with measured steps, her gloves pristine, her posture regal without arrogance. Everett stood already at the table, reviewing the final draft with a solemn expression. His coat was dark, his cravat simple. There was no ostentation in him today. They had not spoken since he signed the marital agreement. Their exchanges since then had been brief, civil, and neutral. But now, as he looked up and met her eyes, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that whatever once stood between them had been scorched down to the bedrock. "Mrs. Moreau," he said, his voice carrying, "shall we begin?" She took her place beside him without hesitation. The table was set with two identical pens and a ledger so thick it seemed to hum with the weight of its own pages. A clerk read aloud the terms of the revised charter, an expansion of service lines, new safety protocols, investment dividends, and, most notably, the official recognition of Bella Whitfield Moreau as full partner and shareholder. When Bella stepped forward to sign, there was a moment of absolute stillness. The gathered crowd, railway engineers, financiers, pressmen, clerks, and a few wives seated carefully in the back row, watched with the reverence usually reserved for coronations or funerals. She dipped the pen in ink, signed her name in full, and then looked up. The room exhaled. Everett stepped forward next. When he finished signing, he turned to the crowd, cleared his throat, and addressed them. "In the past months," he began, "many of you have seen my name in headlines, some earned, some not, but what you have not seen, what I failed for too long to acknowledge, is the hand behind what we now sign." He paused, looked directly at Bella. "This company would not stand without the integrity, foresight, and leadership of Mrs. Bella Moreau. Her name is on these documents not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. It belongs here." There was no applause at first, just silence, thick and stunned. Then, slowly, a ripple of clapping began, from the back where the widows sat, where the workers' wives held their breath, and it spread until the room pulsed with it. Bella did not bow. She simply accepted it, quietly, fully. Later that evening, as dusk spilled gold across the coastline, Bella sat alone in her dressing room. She held the garnet pendant in her hands one last time. It was beautiful still, deep red, familiar, but it no longer felt like hers. She opened the drawer of her vanity and placed it gently inside, beside a bundle of old letters and pressed violets. Then she reached for the sapphire brooch and fastened it over her collarbone. There was a knock. Maisie entered, her cheeks flushed, her eyes brighter than usual. She wore a deep green travelling coat with brass buttons, and a small leather valise was tucked beneath her arm. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," she said, trying to smile. Bella rose and took her hands. "You're ready. I'm terrified." "That means you're not arrogant. It means you'll do it well." Maisie laughed, a nervous, emotional sound. "Do you think I'll succeed?" "I think," Bella said, "that you already have." She reached into her desk and handed Maisie a folded envelope. "Your first month's rent. Use it wisely. Trust your instinct. Speak like someone who expects to be heard." Maisie blinked back tears. "I never thought I'd leave Newport." "You're not leaving," Bella said. "You're expanding." They embraced, and for a long moment they simply stood there. Two women bound not by blood but by choice, by trust, by something stronger than loyalty. When Maisie left, the door closed softly behind her. Bella moved to the balcony. The sea lay quiet beyond the cliffs, a sheet of silver light beneath the rising stars. Somewhere behind her, the fire cracked softly. She breathed deeply, the air crisp, filled with possibility. She had not asked for the world to change. She had only refused to let it change her. And now, with ink still drying on the page, with applause still echoing faintly in her memory, and with the taste of her own power on her tongue, steady, unsweetened, and earned, Bella knew the truth. No one could take this from her. It was hers, by signature, by fire, by will. The sea below the cliffs whispered like a lullaby forgotten by time. Morning light sifted gently through the clouds, catching in the dewdrops along the grass, painting the cliff walk in silver. The path curved along the jagged coastline like a ribbon of memory, weather-worn, unchanging, and carved by the storms it had endured. Bella stood alone near the bend where the hedgerows parted, her slate-blue silk gown brushing against the stone wall. The fabric shimmered faintly, more sea mist than colour, tailored to dignity rather than spectacle. Her hair was pinned high and tight, a single strand having freed itself to trace her cheek. She heard him before she saw him, the rhythm of careful footfalls, the hesitant crunch of gravel behind her. Everett's presence had changed in the past weeks. It no longer demanded attention. It requested space. When she turned, he was there, just a few paces behind, hands ungloved, his overcoat modest and practical. His hair was windblown, no longer sculpted by pomade and ambition. He looked like a man, not a monument. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the stone ledge beside her. Bella gave a slight nod. They stood in silence as the wind teased at their coats and the sea sent salt into their breath. Seagulls wheeled far overhead, distant and untethered. "I've been thinking," Everett began, "about how much I mistook performance for partnership." Bella didn't reply immediately. She let the words hang, unfinished and uncomfortable. "I know I can't undo what I did," he continued, "and I don't expect forgiveness. But I would like to ask, honestly, what you expect from me. Now." Bella looked out at the waves. She remembered being 17 and walking here alone on a borrowed holiday. She remembered the yearning in her chest, the desperate wish to belong, to matter. "Trust will take years," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "It may come, it may not. Love is a different matter. I'm not sure it will return. But respect, Everett, that can begin today. And partnership must begin now. No performance, no pretense. Everett nodded. Then we begin. They didn't shake hands. They didn't embrace, but something passed between them, fragile, honest, raw, the truest start they had ever had. By midday, the sun burned through the mist, and Newport bustled with the quiet energy of industry. At the central yard, a new passenger train stood gleaming under banners of navy and gold. Its polished brass bore a single etched name, Whitfield Line. Bella stood at the platform, her slate blue gown now warmed by sunlight. A light coat draped over her shoulders, and a single leather folder rested in her gloved hands. The wind lifted the hem of her skirt as if in reverence. Letitia Greenfield stood beside her, cane in one hand, parasol in the other. Her morning gown had been softened by a pale amethyst shawl, an almost imperceptible shift, but one that Bella noticed and cherished. Workers moved efficiently, loading parcels, adjusting lanterns, tightening last-minute bolts. One by one, they tipped their caps to Bella as they passed. It was not politeness, it was tribute. A small girl in a cotton dress and sun hat stepped shyly forward from the crowd. She held a single flower, slightly crushed, but still vivid in its bloom. "My papa says you made the train run again," she whispered. Bella knelt slowly, eye to eye with the child. "Your papa helped," she said gently. "We all did." The girl smiled and placed the flower in Bella's hand before darting back to her mother's side. Letitia tilted her head. "You should have someone carve that on your tombstone one day." Bella stood, smoothing her skirt. "I prefer to live by it first." The final whistle blew, sharp and triumphant. Steam hissed like applause. Bella turned toward the train, and for a moment her eyes glistened, not with tears, but with the sheen of a soul that had finally, firmly, taken root in the world she once feared would reject her. This was not the end of her story. This was the platform, the departure. She had been the girl in the photograph, the orphan in front of the sugar warehouse. She had been the wife in the lavender gown, the one who stood still while everything shattered. She had been the woman at the rail yard, the one with ink-stained gloves and coal dust on her hem. Now she was Bella Whitfield Moreau, not because of a marriage, not because of a name carved on a manor door, but because she had chosen herself again and again when the world gave her every reason not to. She walked toward the front of the train, the flower in her hand, the wind at her back. And this time, no one waited for her to speak. They listened. The wind had changed in Newport. It no longer carried the sharp scent of coal and seaweed, but something softer, wood smoke, rustling leaves, the distant chime of a school bell. The mansions along Bellevue Avenue still stood grand and defiant, but their windows reflected different things now. Children running where whispers once echoed, women at the helm of meetings, decisions, futures. The world had not reinvented itself, but it had bent, just slightly, toward those who had insisted on being seen. At the Whitfield station, the name still shone in brass. The trains ran on time, clean and full. There were no banners, no photographers waiting for a moment. The moment, it seemed, had become the life itself. Bella stood beneath the old iron arch as a train pulled in, steam curling around her ankles like memory. Her slate blue coat was lined with velvet now, her gloves trimmed with delicate embroidery. Her hair had streaks of silver at the temples, though still pinned high. In her hand was not a folder or an agenda, but a small bouquet, maple leaves tied with twine, given to her by a schoolgirl with a gap-toothed smile. The children had begun calling her Lady of the Tracks. Behind her, Letitia sat on a carved wooden bench, wrapped in a wool shawl and watching the clouds with that same shrewd, hawk-eyed grace. She had gone nearly blind in one eye, but claimed it made her twice as perceptive. Maisie had written last week from Boston, her shop now a cooperative with 3 seamstresses and 2 apprentices. She'd included a sketch of a gown Bella had once described, silk the color of rain-drenched stone, simple and unyielding. On the back of the letter, Maisie had scrawled, "I owe you every stitch." Evelyn Ravenshaw's name was last seen in a European scandal sheet. her debts having caught up with her in Vienna, her titles traded for diamonds that had long since been repossessed. Some whispered she married again, some whispered she didn't, but no one in Newport spoke her name aloud anymore. As for Everett, he arrived just past noon, always punctual now. He no longer carried a pocket watch. He asked Bella for the time instead. His beard had thickened with age, and his jackets no longer bore gold buttons or decorative chains. He had become a quiet man, not by resignation, but by intention. He approached her without ceremony. "There was a hawk over the marsh this morning," he said, standing beside her. "Reminded me of you." Bella raised an eyebrow. Stern and solitary, sharp-eyed, and impossible to forget. They did not touch, but they didn't need to. Time had taught them a gentler rhythm, no longer ruled by longing or regret, but by something steadier. They still slept in separate rooms. Sometimes she joined him for tea, sometimes she didn't. But he had become her partner, her equal. And on the rare days when her hands trembled or her heart doubted, he reminded her, not with words, but with presence, that she had never needed saving, only recognition. From the platform, a boy ran up with a message from the school kitchen. The bread delivery had arrived early, and they'd named the recipe after her, Bella's Harvest Loaf. She laughed. Letitia scoffed. The train pulled out, leaving only its echo. Bella turned her face to the autumn sun, eyes half closed. The world had not become perfect, but it had become hers, and when the breeze lifted her coat, tugging gently at the hem, she stepped forward, into the light, into the chill, into everything she had built, not as someone waiting to be remembered, but as someone who had already endured. She did not look back. There was nothing left behind her that hadn't already been transformed. Some stories are not about finding love, but about remembering your own worth. Bella's journey was never just about a marriage. It was about reclaiming voice, dignity, and the quiet power of choosing yourself, even when the world expects you to stay silent. She walked into the ballroom wearing hope, and she walked out with something even more powerful, resolve. And through betrayal, storms, boardrooms, and silence, she built a life not waiting to be chosen, but choosing herself again and again. If you made it to the end of this story, let us know by typing courage in the comments. It's more than a word, it's the thread that runs through every chapter of Bella's life, and maybe yours too. We would be truly honored if you left a super thanks below to support the team that brings these stories to life. Every gesture, big or small, helps us keep telling the tales that matter. But if you're not able to support that way, don't worry. Sharing this story with a friend, a sister, or someone who needs to hear it is just as powerful. Your voice helps ours travel farther. And if this story moved you, there are more waiting for you in the cards above. Narratives of strength, heartbreak, redemption, and the quiet triumphs of extraordinary women. Thank you for being part of this journey. You are the reason these stories live.